and thank you, friends, for introducing me. My name is Myrian. I'm a second-year PhD student in geography, and I'm currently doing a joint PhD between Panthéon-Sorbonne University and Laval University in Quebec. So today, I would like to share with you some of the theoretical grounds of my PhD project, which is interested, as you can read, with the exile trajectories of young Syrian men living in Paris, Montreal, and Beirut. So, how does that work? Okay. 15 years ago, at the International Conference on Conscientious Objection that was held in Istanbul, Cynthia Enlow, skip one. Cynthia Enlow asked the following question, which is, where are the women in military conscientious objection? And she asked that question in order to raise our attention to the invisibilization of women experiences in this particular field of research. So the interest of this question lies not only in its substance, that is to say, not only in the invisibilization of women in itself, but also in its form, by which I mean in the feminist approach that is used to address the gender divide of a particular field. So the idea of my thesis emerges from a similar question, which was where are the men in forced migration and refugee studies? And that question came to me after I encountered many young Syrian men living in Lebanon during my master thesis. And here are two quotes from a conversation that I had with one of them called Mahdi, who was actually and still is a young artist that had to flee Syria and found refuge, what we can call refuge, in Lebanon in 2017. So he told me the direct reason for fleeing Syria was that military service postponement expired. I can't go to military service, I can't become a soldier or carry weapons. The only language I can speak is the language of heart, and I can't express myself in other manners. And he further told me that when I was thinking about suicide, I was afraid that I was not brave enough to do this, and told myself that I can go back to Syria, let them take me to the army, and then let someone kill me, but I will not shoot at anyone. So it is that conversation with Mahdi that first got me thinking about gender and exile, and most particularly about what it means to talk about gender and exile when working with refugee men. So it is really important here to stress right from the beginning that when asking this particular question about men, I too situate myself in a feminist approach, that is to say in an approach that is strictly concerned with the question of power and with how it unfolds within different social domination structures in our societies. And more specifically, like I said, I'm looking at young Syrian men trajectories of exile, but while at the same time asking the man question, which means that I'm looking at these men trajectories not as a normative experience, but rather by considering these exiled men as gendered subjects. And in that sense, what we call the man question, according to Doel, allows to understand both how gender functions to subordinate some or let's say most men in our societies, but also how men consciously and unconsciously accept privilege with its patriarchal dividend as well as its cost. So for my presentation today, I would like first to talk shortly about the emergence of the field of critical studies on men and masculinities. And then I would like to talk about the existence of forced migration and refugee studies as a separate field from migration studies, which will finally lead to the question of vulnerability and more specifically to the question of men as vulnerable subjects. So let's start with critical studies on men and masculinities. So, despite the historically dominant and normative presence of man as an object of study in the various fields of social sciences, men as gender subjects only appeared very late in social sciences analysis, so let's say around the 70s. And this can, in part, be explained by the feminist urge at this time to ask the woman question to these various social science fields in order to highlight the invisibilization of women within the mechanism of knowledge production. And indeed, as Doel put it, feminist analysis that emerged at that time explored not only women's inequality, but also how the construction of knowledge has been influenced theoretically and empirically by the perspective, concerns, and presumed centrality and universality of men as representative of what is human. Ironically, though, within the feminist theory that developed during the 70s, which was, let's remember, predominantly white and bourgeois, man was essentialized as a universal and undifferentiated figure of domination in a way that it has remained largely absent from gender analysis produced at that time. And this situation has led a small group of academics to develop, in parallel of these feminist analysis, a field of research centered specifically on men, but this time as gendered subjects. So more specifically, the field of critical studies on men and masculinities was developed around the late 80s, beginning of the 90s, and was defined, according to Jeff Hearn, first as a critical field, that is to say, in this context, as feminist or pro-feminist. Second, as focusing on men, and third, as carried out by men and women jointly or separately. And now, since its emergence, the critical studies on men and masculinities have demonstrated, on one part, the importance of feminist approaches for thinking about male experiences through a lens of egalitarian social justice, positing inequality, power, subordination, and oppression as essential components to any meaningful study of men. And in return, studies on masculinities have made it possible to deconstruct and essentialize vision of man, and that thanks to the production of a critical analysis of the notion of a male privilege, and also to the creation of opportunities for collaboration between women and men in the task of dismantling oppressive structures of power. Okay. So let's now turn to the distinction between forced migration and refugee studies and migration studies as separate fields of inquiry. So the field of forced migration and refugee studies has consolidated as a distinct field from migration studies during the mid-90s, and particularly in response to the rapid increase of refugee flows coming from the global south. And it has, from the origin, been structured around legal and administrative categories, which derives not from conceptual categories resulting from empirical work, strictly speaking, but from policies surrounding the governance of refugees, asylum seekers, internally displaced, and stateless people. And in that sense, the field of forced migration and refugee studies, as well as the division it operates between voluntary and involuntary migration, proves to be tightly linked to the development and deployment of national and international policies, serving sometimes to consolidate and sometimes to fragment the system of international protection of displaced persons. As Crowley and Scaparius pointed out, the categories refugee and migrant do not simply exist, but rather are made. So choosing to label or equally not to label someone as a refugee is a powerful and deeply political process, one by which policy agendas are established and which position people as objects of policy in a particular way. And indeed, it is interesting to note that the lexicon structuring the work in forced migration and refugee studies has remained unchanged since its origin, and that despite the fact that numerous empirical studies have for long demonstrated that the refugee as a category in the study of displacement has a very limited descriptive scope, meaning that it has been found inadequate to circumscribe the experiences of a given social group. And this is a point that Malky and Sogyuk made quite clear in their own words, roughly 10 years apart. Malky noting that the term refugee has an analytical usefulness, not as a label for a special generalizable kind or type of person or situation, but only as a broad legal or descriptive rubric that includes within it a world of socioeconomic statuses, personal histories, and psychological or spiritual situations. And Sogyuk saying, around 10 years later, that there is no intrinsic paradigmatic refugee figure to be recognized and registered, regardless of historical contingencies. And instead, there are 1,000 multifarious refugee experiences and 1,000 refugee figures whose meaning and identities are negotiated in the process of displacement in time and place. So it is important to stress that, as these quotes express, that the binary relation placing refugees on one side and migrants on the other highly ignores the complexity of the migration motives at the outset, and notably the intersection of economic, political, or social factors. However, although that the distinction between voluntary and involuntary migration has a priori no social analytical relevance, the fact of being apprehended through the label of the refugee implies for the person that is concerned with this label a symbolic relationship, as well as a legal recognition that is linked to special humanitarian protection and to a bundle of rights that is distinct from those of other migrants. And these bureaucratic categories therefore turn out to be relevant not for the analysis of the experiences of exilees themselves, but for the analysis of many political processes as a product of a specific system of governance. So, as I just mentioned, the effective differentiation between migrant and refugee stems from a political process that is rooted in a regime of exclusive rights and privileges for the refugee, which is itself, as a concept, rooted in a legal definition who draws the line between those in needs of protection, so the refugees, and those who aren't, so let's say the migrants. And so my point here is that this established need of protection is intrinsically linked to an idea of vulnerability, which has largely infused the development of gender studies as they were and still are mobilized in the study of forced migration. So now, approaching the realities of refugee men from a critical perspective implies to grasp with the intertwined power relations sitting at the junction of these two important terms, one being refugee and the other being men. And indeed, as a concept, the refugee man raises on the one hand the question of masculinities and on the other hand the question of the legal and administrative categories used to regulate population movements. So depending on how these questions are mobilized, we can find on one side a body of work concerned with male refugees, where the differentiation between forced and voluntary migration seems ambiguous and even non-linguistic. And on the other side, we have a body of work that inversely focuses on refugee males, where the political basis of the category of refugees appears manifest in the conceptual assumptions, the development of research teams, and the associate advocacy. And since the research that emerges from the second group take a starting point the semantic of the refugee, it thereby creates an amalgam between the concept of refugee man and the idea of vulnerability. And as a consequence, the question of the male refugee has so far largely been approached with regards to certain gender-based violence, and in particular rape and sexual violence, compulsory conscription, forced recruitment, and radicalization. Sorry, do I speak too fast?
Yes.
Yes, I do. I feel out of breath. I know. I want to take time. I don't want to answer any questions. Okay. So now, this tendency to invariably portray refugee men as a vulnerable group, to include them in gender analysis, raises several questions about the politics behind such classification, be it aimed at women or men, and both in terms of research and humanitarian practices. So now, lastly, I would like for us to look at the conceptual ambiguities that surround the definitions of vulnerability as it is used in forced migration and refugee studies, as well as the power dynamics hidden and even fortified by the lack of a proper definition. So, according to Herring, the current conceptualizations of vulnerability fall into two dominant schools of thought. The first one attributing vulnerability to specific groups of people, and the second one seeing vulnerability as a universally shared condition. And a review of the academic literature focusing on the use of the concept of vulnerability in social sciences has further shown that much of the work produced between 2000 and 2016 belongs to the first school of thought, which attributes an ontological vulnerability to certain specific groups. So, for example, children, women, the elderly people, the elderly and people with reduced capacities, and etc. However, the vulnerability that is attributed to these social groups is often implicit and is consequently lacking any specific definition. And this kind of definitional laxism often leads to the concept of vulnerability as harm. That is to say, the fact of being vulnerable in front of the idea of harm, but without a specific harm being explicitly targeted. And consequently, some authors have stressed that rather than positing vulnerability as a status or as an identity category, that asking the question, like the simple question, vulnerable to what, would make it possible to think about vulnerability in terms of specific oppressions and broader power structures, and ultimately to escape the pitfalls of a floating or a universalist understanding of vulnerability. Floating understandings being associated with the risk of stigmatization, marginalization, objectification, and also subalternization. These are really hard words to say in English. The universalist definition, like with the possibility of obscuring, denying, or eliminating the essential particularities of a certain group. And take, for example, here the drift of the All Life Matters movement. So now that I hope all these bricks have fallen into places, let's give a look at the work that directly addresses refugees' men's vulnerability. So when painting refugee men as victims or vulnerable subjects, like academic work has the potential to transform public discourses, migration policies, and humanitarian management, which often portray these men as threatening, barbaric, uncivilized, terrorists, etc. But still, while obviously central to the advocacy that is put forward in these strands of work, the concept of vulnerability remains very often undefined by many authors that are using it. And one consequences of vulnerability being poorly defined in this work is that criticism formulated around the question of vulnerability are mainly concerned with the sole logics of practices of humanitarian sorting. So more specifically, rather than contesting the logics of hierarchical and unequal power relations structuring humanitarian work in the context of forced migration, current criticism mainly concentrates around the politico-ideological dispositions of humanitarianism when it comes to, for example, citizenship, religion, ethnicity, or gender, and is highlighting how these dispositions shape and manipulate the way vulnerability is perceived by humanitarian organizations. A second and related consequence is that the extension of the vulnerable category to other very large demographic groups, for example here refugee men, although that rooted in an ideological critique of humanitarian practices, can in the end only extend the authoritarian power of these exact humanitarian practices in such a way as to render, according to the formulation of Lewis Turner, more people more vulnerable in the face of humanitarian deployment, and I would add here in the face of work of academics. So, in that sense, simply recognizing refugee men as vulnerable while maintaining the current system of vulnerability that is in place only serves to expand a system which is, as at its heart, disempowering for refugees, and most importantly, refugees of all genders. And the point here being that the use of what we can call a vulnerability ontology, establishing a conceptual and absolute correspondence between refugees and vulnerability, encourages the production of a sort of what we can call ontic vulnerability, that is to say, the possible loss of concrete and material power in the daily experience of displaced people. So these reflections raise the fundamental question of the theoretical and methodological approaches mobilized in the field of migration research in general, and more specifically, as far as I'm concerned, for the study of the experiences of exile of young Syrian men living in Beirut, Paris, and Montreal. So, very quickly to conclude, more concretely, this translates in my research in a particular set of intersectional and decolonial feminist approaches that make it possible to analyze the interaction between what we can call different domains of power, be they structural, representational, disciplinary, interpersonal, psychic, and bodily. So, to examine the interaction between such domains of power and different social formation, for example, race, gender, class, sexuality, age, etc., in a way to understand how they inform each other in different contexts. So, in my case, namely Paris, Montreal, and Beirut, and most importantly, to understand which specific metrics of domination are encountered by these men, and what are the everyday politics put forward in these by these young men in order to resist these metrics of domination. Finally, I also talk about decolonial feminist approaches because, for me, the use of transversal decolonial praxis helps me to, helps me to stay attentive to the colonial structures that, in the first place, allow the realization of this project, and that are, I believe, informing my own relationship to fieldwork and also to the production of knowledge in general. Voilà. Yes.
Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. Yes, leading up to questions, suggestions, maybe questions.
It's fine if you don't have questions.
I can just give a comment.
We can start with a comment and then a question and then see where it goes.
Okay, thanks very much. I think it's very interesting to problematize the different categories, and not only the one of migration refugees, but also other people on the move. If you think about who are tourists, who are expats, who are, people who do Erasmus, what they are. And so I think that it's very interesting the way that you just say, like also what Maya was saying, that migration is a natural phenomenon, but the definition is political. And I want to stress, for example, that during the so-called refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, in Europe, the Balkan route in 2015, BBC decided to use only the term migrants, and after a week, Al Jazeera answered saying, no, we will use only the terms refugees. Because BBC was saying until they are not recognized as refugees, they are migrants. But Al Jazeera was saying 85% of these people are coming from Eritrea, Yemen, whatever, so they are refugees. So I think it's very interesting to consider the different narratives, but and also to problematize also female and male, whatever. I'd like to ask you, but you show like a lot of different kind of aspects of factors of this way to construct the different categories. But your fieldwork is focusing on what of all this? Is focusing on the narratives of politicians, of policies, or just like the interview to the men, their perception, because I think it could be interesting to compare, to overlap.
Yeah. No. So this is like I said, the theoretical basis. I've been doing my comps recently, so I've just been reading, and but the actual project is to. In Paris, I'm spending all my time in a canteen in Montreuil, which is the Syrian canteen of Montreuil, and it's. I'm interested with the politic in the city, like in a really Hannah Arendt way of thinking about it, like in the spaces between people and how it creates like a relation, a new way of thinking about politics and the us and them and hospitality and all these things. And so I'm trying to find specific spaces in these different cities where Syrian men are acting politically or not politically, like depending on how you define political work. And I'm doing like participant observation, and I'm doing interview too, just to in order to highlight like the and point out the metrics of domination, but also really the resistance toward it. But it also has to do with people like who are not refugees or not migrants, like in the canteen, like who goes to the canteen, and really the relationship between that is produced at the junction of all these different rationals.
So you are looking at the practices, I mean the everyday practices.
Yeah, the really just the invention of I come from the anarchist geography. I just want to look at how we produce, create, invent new spaces where we can think differently about all these topics about citizenship and like who belongs, who not belong, and all these categories, and also how yes, this oppression and like my start was gender because of the quotes I told you in the beginning, but I realized like it has to be intersectional because it has to do with a lot of different other things. So it's a bit not confused, but I was messy in my head now because I'm in the middle of the fieldwork and everything, so I cannot give you a really proper clear answer. But I'm talking with these men. I really don't care about the high level politics and the top down approach. All these, like, it's really not important for me. I really just want to talk with the people and see what they are doing in their everyday life, be they refugees or people who are spending their time in different spaces with refugees or just other human beings, as I will call them. Does it answer your question?
Okay. Great. It was very fast, difficult, but really interesting. I was wondering why, I'm probably trying to add to messiness of your thinking. You just talking about the fact you started with the gender and then you move on to understand different dimensions of subjectivity. I just wonder what kind of standing back a little bit and thinking about migrant subjects in a much more kind of general sense, of whether there is a sense in which they are really something which cannot be fully described, something which is not necessarily, can be crystallized in whatever, in a particular definition. I just wonder, obviously there is a sort of approach which is the governmental approach, trying to give them names, trying to give them labels, trying to place them within a certain field and then ascribe certain qualities to them. But generally speaking, the whole point about mobility is that people escape all these categorizations, in different ways. Here Maya really talking about how it's very difficult to think about Ukrainians because they don't exist, or they exist but a very different reality. I'm thinking about people like Papandopoulos Tsanas, Papandopoulos and Tsianas, who wrote about this sort of undocumented, untamed mobility of people who basically just have no kind of sense of coherent identity. About these migrants crossing Mediterranean, who adopt different kind of identity depending on what's going on, burn their documents and passports, trying to kind of stay away from all the definitions. I just wonder if you have tried to kind of step away from all those attempts to categorize people along the different lines of identity and think beyond and think about, think with people like Deleuze and Guattari, kind of something which is a larval subject, something which sort of emerges and disappears, something breaks together and separates into something else.
Yeah. Yes. So these categories were useful in the beginning because, that's why I do the division between migration studies and forced migration and refugee studies, because when you look at the literature, it is like this. I tried to explain that, but maybe it was too quick. But the distinction, if you go to migration studies, you will find books who say, oh, migrant women are invisibilized, there is only about men and blah, blah, blah. And that's true, because they are focusing on migratory experiences. But if you, like, that's what I try to say, forced migration and refugee studies is tightly linked with that concept of vulnerability. And this is why, if you want to include or start talking or find literature that talks specifically about refugee men as refugees, in that field, it has to be linked with vulnerability. And that's why I felt like all the work I did throughout my master, like I was like, where are the men? And then when I was shocked when I talked with men in Beirut, because I was like, that seems really vulnerable and precarious existence to me. Like, you're stuck somewhere, you don't have any status, you cannot go back, or you have to do the military service and probably be killed or thrown in prison or anything. And then my first, so that's why I think about these categories, because the categories comes with the idea of vulnerability, and then when you start, like, but once you start thinking about vulnerability for itself, you quickly go away from the categories. It doesn't matter anymore, but it still has to be pending in between in your way of thinking about it, because I mean, as a researcher, I'm in dialogue with people who are in particular fields, and that's why it always has to be there. But when I'm on the field, when I'm talking with people, I really don't care. I normally don't know in the beginning, before I do an interview, which status they have or anything. I know they come from Syria, I know they have been living in Paris or Montreal or Beirut, but like, and in Lebanon, for example, they are not recognized as refugees anyway, so it doesn't really... Is it answering your question? Not really.
I think you can fit into what I was trying to say effectively as well. I think if vulnerability... I like the second part of your vulnerability argument. You know, the one where you talk about vulnerability being a human condition. We're vulnerable, we're all going to die. You know, it's inevitable, and I'm going to talk about it more later. I'm sorry about the excitement of dying, but the sense in which it's, you know, we're all sort of exposed to it, we're all vulnerable. So that division in terms of gender, sort of other kind of things, which, you know, representational, is blurred in a sense. We're all kind of exposed to death. We're all sort of vulnerable.
Yeah, but that falls in the universalist definition of vulnerability, which can, like I said, can lead to these kind of derives like the all life matters movements. So yes, maybe in a sense, like Judith Butler talked about that we're all vulnerable, and there is kind of a ontic vulnerability like for everyone, but that's why it's important, like as Clark put it, like to ask vulnerable to what. So you say we are all vulnerable, yes, but your vulnerability is really different from someone without papers in the street and everything, and that's why you have to really spot it, which the domination metrics is really useful, so you can really try to see in a particular context to which kind of things a certain person is vulnerable, and how when it relates to the gender, to the race, to the age, to the and I think that to put all these things together is a step in a good direction, just to stop just calling large group of people as vulnerable and just like impeding themselves to just be like who they are and just being a vulnerable subject. So I think it's just important to go behind the label of being vulnerable and to understand who these people are and what they are doing actually, because when you're labeled as a vulnerable person, you normally it's stopped there. Oh, you're vulnerable. Let me help you. But maybe I can help even if I'm vulnerable. That's the kind of thing I'm trying to go to get through. Does it answer your question? Not really. Sorry.
We can continue, I think, the sort of deeper debate a little bit later there. I think we have time for two more brief questions, sort of thing, and then we'll move on to the Marcus first, and one there.
It's a suggestion, something you might find interesting. Given you talk about vulnerability and feminism, I just wonder if you come across Donna Haraway, the work of Donna Haraway, because she does something very interesting with the word responsible, where she turns that word into response able, as a capacity, as a power, with all the differential qualities that invokes. It doesn't work etymologically, but let's forget that. And I think you do the same thing with vulnerable. The capacity, the power to be. So we get everyone is ontologically exposed, being towards death, the irreversibility of time. But but it doesn't necessarily need to be a kind of flat, uniform, passive thing. We're all vulnerable. If you think of it as able, a capacity, power. So I just wonder if you come across Donna Haraway's work on response, able. She's talking in relation to climate crisis and what is our response ability in relation to that. You might have some interesting thoughts if you just substitute the word vulnerable.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will give it a look. I know Donna Haraway other work, but not that particular one. So, thank you. That's a good point.
And lastly, Philip.
Didn't understand like all the debates about vulnerability, but I like what you propose here, and I wanted to know if during your fieldwork work in Montreal and Beirut, have you observed some specific vulnerabilities for like men refugees there, like some specific vulnerabilities because of the local context? For example, like in Paris, like alone men are less prioritized for like emergency housing. So I wanted to know if you have already observed some specific factors or specific vulnerabilities for those.
But it's really classic, like strand of vulnerability, like you said, housing, like because. That particular place where I do my fieldwork is more than the Syrian canteen. There is other collectives working there, and so there is really a different strand of people hanging. And so there is not only like Syrian refugees. There is other people. So there was other migrants without like papers or anything, like looking for housing. So yes, this and racial oppression in the city. So I mean I've came across classic structural, administrative, kind of oppression. But I'm kind of not really in the beginning of my fieldwork, but I feel like it's the beginning. But I've been most interested with the politics happening at that particular place. So in terms of relationship in between people, so like kind of an everyday politics happening, and also the advocacy that is put forward, these the Syrian and French people together, like every other Friday, like raising political events and sharing the word and just having really meaningful discussion from the people living in the neighborhood, the town of Montreal actually. And this is what is really striking and interesting to me. Also the fact of, when talking about hospitality, like when I go there, I feel like I'm hosted by refugees who are at the canteen, working in the canteen, and so it's like from my perspective, my positionality, it's really interesting to like. I mean, I'm from Canada. I'm not hosting anybody in France, but you see in terms of statuses and everything, like my statuses. So I'm sorry, I don't have a really clear-cut answer because I don't have any result, and I'm just like taking loads of notes and just hanging with people. So.
Sorry?
Just a really quick comment.
Okay, that's really
quick. You might, I found really useful when I was trying to manage my position in the Refugee Drop-In Centre by reading Jonathan Darling's article about his experience in the Refugee Drop-In Centre, about his positionality in the Drop-In Centre, and about how small things matter, about if they don't let you make the tea, and that kind of thing you do as told. I found that article really, really useful.
It's Darling, Jonathan Darling, right?
Yeah.
You give me the exact name after the yes. Okay, thank you. I will. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Next we have Angharad from our very own department. There you go.
Thank you, Franz. I was trying to look if there's a clock so I know how long I'm talking for. Give me a wave. Okay, thank you, Franz and Mila, for organising such a stimulating conference. I've enjoyed listening to all the papers, and thank you for giving me an opportunity to present some of this work, which emerges from a book of mine that's coming out in September called National Affects. And I hope it has something to say to this conference, in the fact that in it I've tried to trace how the nation is experienced as a feeling, or a set of feelings circling in the air at different times and moments. This is the central question of the book here. In doing that, I've organised the book around a series of events or crises. So it started for me with the London 2012 Olympic Games. It ends with COVID. But in between, I go to Brexit, the funeral of Margaret Thatcher, and the 2015 so-called refugee crisis. And I use that term with care. I know that migration scholars have critiqued the very framing of it as a crisis. So today I want to present, please, some of the overarching framework, hoping that it may be of interest to others here. And then I want to focus a little bit on one chapter that addresses the 2015 refugee crisis, in particular how ideas about us and them were circling in the UK at that time, but across Europe more generally. Ideas about wanting to be generous, but also inhospitable ideas about others that we consider to be different from ourselves. And by complete chance, Myriam, in this chapter, I try to work with the concept of vulnerability. Absolute chance that we should be working with the same sort of ideas. So thank you for your presentation, which has in fact done a lot of work for me in helping to introduce that work in the room. And I hope to be able to complement some of the questions and limits of the concept that you've already introduced. So I was presenting this material last week to studies of nationalism audiences, where I ask, how is it that this thing called nationalism continues to persist in global politics? We're told that we're living through a return in nationalism in the public sphere, not only here, but in Brazil, in India. We know that these ideas about us and them are strong currently in global politics. We know this from Boris Johnson's government too. And what I hope to offer by turning to affect is another way into trying to understand this persistence of the national frame. However, I think I can use Maya's presentation this morning and the broader themes of this conference to say I'm not really interested in studies of nationalism per se as a specific ideology or something. What I'm trying to get at here is this framework enabled by the sovereign state system that discriminates between citizens and non-citizens, people who are welcome, people who are not, and all the different forms that takes. So that's what I'm more broadly interested in, and how that continues. So coming from a background in politics and international relations, I relate that to a geopolitical cartography, but being based in geography and becoming interested in affect theory in the time of writing this book, I really wanted to try and understand how these ideas take hold in such ordinary ways. So, for example, in the aftermath of Brexit, how I felt these ideas in walking down the street or going to the cinema or at the school gate. That's the sort of register I've been interested in. So why affect? I've put these, or what do I mean by affect also? I've put these quotes here, and I'm not going to read through them. I've drawn on the work of Teresa Brennan, Kathleen Stewart and others, And again, I can refer to debates that have already gone on here this morning, points that Sergei has made and Maya has made about how this is a relational approach, that the very idea of them means that we also have ideas about who we are. It's about, according to Sarah Ahmed, about the intimacy of being with others. But she says that ideas about who they are produced through emotions. Something that I've written about as kind of seen through an event such as an Olympic Games. However, I've also centred Hassan Hage's amazing work on nationalism here because I'm eager to quickly establish that this is not about my feelings or our feelings or any sort of kind of internalized emotion. It's about how feelings are shared and produce stuff and operate politically. So Hassan Hage says, we can't understand everyday processes of nation building without also thinking about all the ways in which we try to make ourselves comfortable in the world every day. And he even takes it down to the register of the tools we used in the garden to kill insects on our plants. These are the ways in which we make ourselves comfortable in the world, and they involve all sorts of minor cruelties. I think Hassan Hage, with this concept of domestication there, is really tapping into what I'm trying to get at too, those sort of processes of national affects. And the very final point, I think that the affective literature also helped me try to think about the nation, or ideas about us and them, as not always the same in all contexts. And I know this is a really obvious point, but nevertheless, in studies of nations and nationalism, sometimes we read about processes of nation building as operating quite horizontally, whereas in fact, sometimes these ideas are present and really loud, and sometimes they're not. Or we come across them, or we find ourselves really constricted by them in particular atmospheric contexts. So think about the response to 9/11. Judith Butler talks about the heightened nationalism in the US public sphere at that time, which made it difficult to make particular critical views heard. That's the kind of going in and out of focus that I'm getting at. Okay, so very quickly, I therefore define national affects as this effort to orchestrate a sense of unity during a time of crisis or major event. So this, I think it was the first of your 3 points, Maya, about the elimination of time and change and a settled account of a community in unity. How that will, of course, be part of the Jubilee celebrations this week, and it's already been in some of the events like the horses show or something that's already been that I watched. So that sort of stuff. But of course, affects are not straightforwardly connected to one spatial formation, as Ben Anderson and Helen Whitson have said. I'm not trying to say that this is national in all instances, all cases. In all the cases I refer to, there are always other solidarities, other ways of thinking about being together at work, operating underneath, alongside, and through the national. These are the objects that I'm interested in, but I'm also trying to use affect as a method in the book. As an approach, a different way into thinking politically. And this is how I'm eventually coming to vulnerability. Because I felt that the affect literatures were also helping me with trying to get at another understanding of politics. And the best way of trying to I find of trying to talk through this is to go back to that kind of post-Brexit atmosphere in the UK, where, to cite you, Marcus, I think when you talked about the whole thing being demented, there was a sense that there was no rational basis to this event and to this vote. People had voted for all sorts of different random reasons. And it was not necessarily because they weren't informed enough or they didn't have the right knowledge. There were just lots of affective stuff going on. And so in that context, I felt it was very clear that, you know, and also obvious to the pollsters and the political scientists who had failed to predict the event, that we needed an understanding of politics as much more than a rational choice or a decision or a set of ideas that people decide to follow or not. We have to understand politics as also having a lot to do with affective emotions, positions, and so on. As a method, this also helped me get away from a methodological nationalism, so that reproduces ideas of us and them in the course of trying to understand them. So another version of that is the idea of people from somewhere and people from nowhere. It is ridiculous to think of the whole world as being able to be split between people from somewhere or people from nowhere. And yet it's such a powerful, seductive, to use your word, framing of an event like Brexit. So how do we complicate these geographies? But most of all, the stuff I was reading from Kathleen Stewart, Lauren Berlant, Eve Sedgwick, was helping me try to loosen an understanding of power as all-encompassing or always working. And when we think that power always works, is always successful in what it sets out to do, it becomes really hard to think that we can ever change anything, because power is so dominant and able to succeed every time. So building on the work of Michel Foucault, Eve Sedgwick and others, I was inspired to think about what can we do then beyond trying to reveal that there are identities at work, or that the economy is at work, or there are structural forces at work. What else could critique offer and do? So to give another example here of what I'm trying to get at, lots of my lovely critical academic friends in lovely metropolitan cities were asking me in the aftermath of Brexit, what have they done? What have you all done? What have people in the places where you live done? Didn't they know? Shouldn't they know better? All these kinds of questions, which to my mind were infuriating, but also dangerous for how they were reproducing ideas about the proper views and the not proper views, or the educated people and the uneducated people, or this idea that some people have the answers and other people just need to learn the answers, and then politics will be okay. You know, so what if progress politically is not about getting some people to understand the enlightened way of thinking, or bringing some people from one position into another position? What if we can't wait around that long, that we have to instead think about the possibility of tiny shifts or loosening a particular toxic atmosphere, say? So that's what I was interested in doing. And now I can turn to the refugee crisis and this chapter on vulnerability. The initial draw, or what was interesting for me about the refugee crisis, was just how much it was being captured in different artworks. Anna and Myrto, in this great book, they say that it was the most photographed humanitarian crisis in history. I'm not sure if that's true, but certainly there were an enormous amount of visual images of people arriving off boats, but also lots of artistic responses. I went to an event in 2017 in Tate Modern with several different artistic representations of the crisis. And there was one really powerful by Byrne O'Donoghue, who had created a little paper boat for every person who had died crossing the Mediterranean Sea that year. Another person who was taking a Polaroid photograph of everyone coming off a boat. And there was something interesting to me here in all this kind of all these artistic initiatives emerging in response. And in the chapter, I focus mainly on Ai Weiwei's work, the Chinese artist living in exile in Berlin, and who moved his whole artistic studio for this period to Lesbos in Greece to develop immediate responses to the crisis. And this one piece mimics a boat from the National Gallery of Prague exhibition of his in 2017. So I turn to some of those artistic responses. And the reason I do that is because there were lots of kind of standard ideas about responding in times of crisis emerging through some of these artworks, at least in my opinion. So ideas about how we must do something now, ideas about how we must get closer to the crisis. So Ai Weiwei going from Berlin to Lesbos to help. And lots of the students that I taught in Swansea in that year, in 2016, who worked in the swimming pool here, went to work as lifeguards on Greek islands that summer. It was really inspirational how much people wanted to do something. And also I wanted to question this urge to do something, and what does it mean? So to put that in a quote, I was responding to an old problem, of course, beautifully summarised here by Susan Sontag, where we see suffering and it makes us think we need to care more, but sometimes it also makes the sufferings and misfortunes appear so vast, so epic, that we feel, well, we just can't do anything, it's just too vast. With a subject conceived on this scale, compassion can only flounder, Susan Sontag says. Or in another example that I use in the book from the work of William Walters and Barbara Luthi, they say there are risks in the idea that exposing the crisis through scenes of violence will necessarily generate reform. It can have the opposite effect. It can serve to fuel the border spectacle. It can serve simply to just intensify these ideas of us and them. Now, of course, there's a huge literature on the risks in ideas around humanitarianism, how they produce their own sets of problems, or produce their own violences. But mostly what I was trying to do here was not critique these initiatives or take away from people's urges to do something, but just to try and think with them about how we might do politics differently. So I wanted to ask things like, what happens after that urge to do something? And in the current context, that might be what happens after we've all put a Ukraine flag in our window. And from this, I was drawing on the literatures on vulnerability to think, how can we think about being political without this figure of the striving individual actor who's going to go out and do something? So for me, the affective literatures, particularly the work maybe of Sian Guy here on ugly feelings, also feminist work that has tried to rethink depression and other depressive states or ugly feelings. They all engage with this question of what might being political mean if we can't all be that heroic actor who goes out and volunteers as a lifeguard, or that is able to do what Susan Sontag was unable to do, that is to watch the scenes of suffering and just respond, not feel overwhelmed, not feel such overwhelming sadness that they don't know what they might do. So what happens to all the other ways in which we might act? This eventually brought me back to Hannah Arendt's work on acting, because Franz told me, oh, you've got to go and read Hannah Arendt, and that came quite late in the process, and I really should have read it all sooner. And the other thing that was going on in the stuff that I was trying to think against was this geography of here and there, proximity, distance. So how do we think politically without making that separation every time? So we see this separation in Ai Weiwei's work here, where he's brought orange life jackets here from Lesbos and wrapped them around a concert house in Berlin, so bringing the crisis closer to people. And the suggestion is, you know, if you see it on your way to the concert, you'll do something, you'll act. And I'm just not convinced that we act because it's brought closer, or that it's exposed to us in that way. Here's another photo of Ai Weiwei's collection at that point, where he restaged the photo of Alan Kurdi, but I'll move on from that because in the end I didn't get permission to use that in my book. They refused to allow me to republish it, so I had to scrap that interesting discussion. I'll keep that for teaching. From the vulnerability literatures, and I can now just sort of add to the stuff that Myriam has already outlined about the risks with it, and absolutely importantly, the different ways in which vulnerability is experienced. That has to be said out loud, you know, that vulnerability means something so different in each context and to each person, population, so on. But I was inspired by the second book here, the collection by Judith Butler, Gambetti and Sabse on resistance and vulnerability, where they ask, why is it that vulnerability is always put as the opposite to resistance? So you're feeling vulnerable, so you can't go and act. What if we change that around and say, well, we are all vulnerable with all the kind of qualifications of that we are all differently vulnerable, or we might all be feeling, many of us might be feeling overwhelmed, but what account of personhood might emerge from starting there? So Maya's point, what happens if we start there? And one of the things that might happen is the first point from Berlant, that we stop thinking of crisis as kind of a unique event, and we think instead about the ongoingness of crisis, that there are multiple crises that are around us at any single time. And indeed, that, you know, the literatures on migration back this up by saying, you know, once the crisis is out of the news, human suffering hasn't ended for populations we describe as refugees and asylum seekers. Just think of all the hotspots, the huge camps in Greece where there is still no resolution about where these people will go and live, and they are hugely overpopulated by about 15,000 people to a camp designed for 5,000 people. So thinking beyond crisis to working with vulnerability, and I'll conclude, Franz, I know I'm over time, by saying I try and do that in this chapter by working with this novel by Ali Smith, which is actually about Brexit and the refugee crisis discussed together. And she opens the novel with this amazing scene of people lying on the beach in the Mediterranean, sipping drinks and checking their phones as the dead wash up on the shore beside them. So it's about the kind of the ways in which we are living alongside these mass deaths in our everyday lives. And that there's no easy way, or she rather not only complicates ideas about us and them, but complicates ideas about distance and proximity just with that scene of the diffuseness of suffering. And from it, I tried to develop a sense of how we might act through this idea of slow actions. So, again, drawing on the literatures on vulnerability, instead of trying to think of that striving actor who can go out and do something, Bonnie Honig, drawing on Adriana Cavarero, instead draws inspiration for thinking politically from bodies involved in caring work, who are perhaps sharing a hand with another or helping to lift someone else up. People positioned in the dirt of experience, but with different bodily postures to that upright posture and ethics of moral rectitude. So maybe a bodily gesture of how we might be political that looks very different to that heroic actor. And in this final scene I'd like to highlight, there's a moment in the novel where the mother of the main character tells her that a new electric fence is going to be built in this otherwise quiet English village. So just after Brexit, there's news that an electric fence is going to go up. And her mother takes out an ordnance survey map and pins it to the wall and says, look, this is where the fence will be built. And her mum is not any sort of political actor. She spends most of her time watching TV game shows, but she has heard of this fence and wants to share the news with her daughter. So a fence 3 meters high with a roll of razor wire has been erected across a stretch of land not far from the village, and it has security cameras on posts along it. Go and see it, her mother says. I want you to do something about it. And Elizabeth says, what can I do? I'm just a lecturer in the history of art. And her mother shakes her head and says, you'll know what to do. She says, you're young. Come on, we'll both go. And from this moment, I just try to develop some sort of more modest, gentle account of what it might mean to do something, but from this position of uncertainty about what the future might look like, or what indeed are our capacities or are our abilities, but nevertheless working together with that uncertainty, they decide they'll go and give it a go. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much for this, and it's been inspiring to see how finally not into this book form now, because I obviously followed your drawing with the book along, so really, really great to see that. Opening up the floor again to questions, comments, or other interventions. Oscar?
Yes, thanks for this very interesting presentation. I have a couple of general questions that because I'm particularly interested in that, and also your book looks quite promising. I hope that it's going to be out soon. But this is about in the context I'm talking about, you choose the national anthem, and now looking at the populist literature, there's a strong focus on affect. And my question is about this, you have some reflections about the national populist affect, that they intertwine, they are different, and the second one is also related to reflections about there is no rational choice and all the topics about rationality and how you consider affect in terms of everyday democracy, this sort of weakness, the strength of democracy, how you see the connection between rationality and affect. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, and I want to articulate that. I have written a little bit on the relationship between, as I see it, the nation and populism. So in that one article that I wrote about Brexit, but really feel there was a lot I didn't manage to talk about. And then I've written a textbook chapter about what is populism. And again, I feel like I haven't managed to get out exactly what I want to say. And there was a short Society and Space blog piece I wrote about the election of Boris Johnson, when I felt mad in that period. But then in the end, it wasn't published until the day of the first COVID lockdown, so it just disappeared into an abyss of, forgotten forever. But what I was mad about in the Boris Johnson time and previous to that, the Corbyn era, was the idea that we have to respond to populism with a better idea of the people. So this relates back to the first talk. If only we come up with a good account of the people, when the people are nice and embrace the NHS, or that the people are Welsh rather than English, or whatever different version of the people we have, then we can look forward to a better democracy or better inclusion in the nation state. So it's that problem that I would want to write against, but it is really hard in the populism literatures because you're so dominated by the idea of the people. It becomes such a strong framework. So I suppose you can write against it by going through migration, which is what Nicholas de Genova does in a really useful article in South Atlantic Quarterly on notes on populism. But again, there should be some way of undoing that work on the people. Of course, there's a Columbia University Press book, What is the People? That's really useful. That does this too, Alain Badiou and several other authors. But yes, I would like to write something more specific about populism and affect and trying to depart from this rational account of politics that we just need to replace the bad people with the better people. I can see how that connects with the work that you're looking at in cities rising up against national governments as well. So I'd like to learn more from that.
Just a couple of suggestions. Thanks very much. You quoted Sontag. I don't know if you know Susie Linfield. There is a book which is called The Cruel Radiance, where she kind of operationalized this idea of Susan Sontag, talking about the ambiguity between the ethics of showing and the ethics of seeing. Because there is this kind of ambivalence, because someone is showing, but then it's about the spectator. What about this emotion, as you say? This emotion can be action, can be indifference, can be even hate.
Yeah.
And another one is about also, like when you quote Cavarero, which I really like as philosopher. I don't know if you know also the work of the Care Collective, and for example Sarah Ahmed, in terms of emotions and caring. So I suggest you to have a look, because they also work on something similar, and they try to kind of make very operative this theoretical approach.
Thank you. I'll come for the proper spellings after this, but thank you very much. They sound great.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting talk. If I understood you correctly, I'm not sure about what. To what extent are you sort of looking at those who portray the only way to change things is to sort of really go the whole hog, sort of totalising sort of route? Those are opposite, in my opinion, to the modest theory and practices that you're saying are really crucial. I wonder if you're sort of looking at who pushes the. I'm thinking about something like the global warming crisis. So those who say the only way to deal with this is no more flying, no more this, no more that. That's the only way to do it. We're only just doing small scale stuff. But is that sort of those who sort of pursue that absolutist, totalist line, a sort of area of research for you to look at as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting link to the climate activism there, Keith. Yeah, I'd say I'm suspicious of the, ground zero approach. Let's go back to zero, and the thing that comes with it, of course, the narrative of redemption. We can, overcome the present. And that's because of trying to write against nationalism. Nationalism has year zeros and theories of redemption. So to me, that kind of politics shares too much with a very dangerous politics where you have to potentially eliminate the other or erase the grounds in the kind of ways we're seeing in eastern Ukraine at the moment. Yeah, just go right back to and start again. And I haven't thought through how these work in climate activism, but I'd like to think more about that, in particular with teaching this course on crisis and the environment and global change next year, because I think we know anecdotally these ideas are heavy in that movement, and they're potentially stifling, and they inhibit things from happening rather than enable. I see it also in schools. So my daughter's just brought home a book that she has to read for school about climate change, and it's called Into the Darkness. And I was asking, what's it about? And she says, it's about that we're how everybody has to wear gas masks all the time and live in underground bunkers, and that's what the future looks like.
This is it.
I thought, well, that's interesting, and it's doubly interesting because they've just gone from reading about refugees and now they're going to read about climate change, but these are the frameworks through which they're being introduced to these crises, so the very apocalyptic frameworks. And that's not to say that there is no, there are obviously huge apocalyptic scientific facts in front of us, but how we narrate that and how we, to each other, how we build communities of people who are going to do stuff, I don't know if that approach works.
Thank you very much again.
Thank you, Franz.
All right, last but not least, okay. Technically more, because I don't know how it changed.
I don't know, I'm wondering. I'll do it. Okay. Great. So, Marcus, are you going to stop me, or is it Franz who's going to stop me? Okay, fair enough. Okay, I'll put a timer there just in case. So, yeah, thank you very much to Mila, who disappeared, and to Franz for organizing this event. Well done. I will, put a very interesting discussion together. Thank you for giving me an opportunity to speak. This paper is. People will be writing together with a colleague of mine, Hiroka Hara, who is the associate professor in the Prefectural University of Kumamoto. So all the spellings, all the expressions Japanese are not mine. This is disclaimer. So, if I mispronounce things, I didn't mean it. But also I checked with her last week and she sort of taught me how to say things correctly. So, I'll do my best. Japanese is clearly not something I know well. But what I want to do today is talk about the impossible disaster. So let me start with kind of talking about the disaster which happened on 11th of March 2011. And first there was a massive earthquake, a great Japan earthquake, 9 megawatts, 70 kilometers offshore of the eastern coast of Japan. This was followed by tsunamis, a massive wave up to 40 meter high, sort of moving inland up to 10 kilometers, so huge sense of devastation. And then to kind of make things worse, the effects of tsunami and earthquake caused the meltdown of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant, which was classified as a major accident, one of the most devastating nuclear disasters in human history. So what we witnessed in 2011 was this kind of impossible event, which strangely was based on assumptions about safety and security. So there's lots of work done by the TEPCO, Tokyo Electric Power Company, who really advertised the effects of the nuclear power energy, had a mascot which was called Denko-chan to popularize the effects of nuclear power, showing how exciting it is, teaching children in schools, that they should really embrace nuclear power. And they were talking about benefits of nuclear energy and safety really clearly about how this energy was produced. And yet the disaster which was deemed impossible really happened. So it sort of questioned this rational approach, rational point of view, and led to massive displacement of people and devastation beyond perception. So how do we relate to this and speak about the encounter with something which is foreign, something which is the other in this disaster? As a result of these events, the human expectations about possible and impossible were kind of thrown up in the air. The disaster suspended the rational and intentional subject, the I, the subject kind of who was unsettled, broken, devastated by this disaster, internally traumatized. And I want to kind of to think about this disaster subject, this traumatized person kind of thrown up in the air, whose whole world is kind of suspended. So hold this picture in your hand when I'm kind of moving through the slides. So when this self, when the person faces death in that strange, traumatic event, of earthquake, tsunami, disaster, you name it, what else can happen really? So what happens to this to the situation when someone faces something they cannot own, something beyond belief, and how they can possibly think about mastering death and try to comprehend it? How can we understand things like this, which are clearly beyond us? So even those who escaped death and survived the incident were traumatized due to the anxiety about the government's responses, fear of radiation, things which we cannot really see, something which is invisible but deadly. And it was combined with the experience of dislocation and the stigma of having come from a contaminated area, which was a massive thing in the Japanese society. So, what kind of responses did Fukushima disaster produce? After the disaster, people were ordered by the Japanese government to move from the irradiated areas. The government raised the international standard of 1 millisieverts per year, so it's a measurement of radiation which was accepted as acceptable standard of living, to 20 millisieverts per year as the annual radiation exposure limit, to create a range of different evacuation zones. So you can see here different areas on the map, sort of less dangerous, more dangerous, to be immediately evacuated. So for people who had to be forced out, or the kind of people were given a little bit more time. And the irony with people were moved between these different areas as the flow of air changed. And originally they were moved from low-lying areas to which was sort of subjected to tsunami, to higher-lying areas, thinking that's going to be safe. But that's where the radiation the acid rain was falling. So they moved again. So in a period of about 3 months, there was a massive sense of dislocation. It wasn't one-off movement. So we're talking about forced migration. The people really kind of lost sense of what is safe, what is not safe. The government response to this kind of range of different zones, evacuation zones, based on the measurements of radiation, was seen as rational. And this is where my Japanese comes into place. Goriteki. So something which was based on this kind of rational understanding of how radiation works and how people have to be moved. There were about 110,000 mandatory evacuees recognized as legitimate and victims in this process by the government. Some people also moved from irradiated areas without being ordered to do so by the government. For example, a local resident of Minamisoma, so this is a city just here, if I can see it correctly. Yeah, we were there with Marcus in 2018. The city most affected by nuclear disaster spoke about the psychological trauma caused by the Fukushima events. He said, I want to escape as far away as possible because the site of this place, the area of Minamisoma, where the evacuation advisory has been lifted, breaks my heart. So the sense of kind of really emotional response to this. He couldn't stay there, couldn't contemplate staying there altogether. So in this case, there was really attempts to kind of think about how do we come to terms with this? How do we sort of understand? How do we normalize something which is really beyond belief? Both compulsory and voluntary evacuees were often described using the term, and another one, tojisha. So, I'm really pushing the boundaries of language there in many different ways. This literally means directly affected people, which has a quite positive connotation in Japan insofar as it refers to agents who are seeking redress for damage on their own initiative. So very often this is used as some victim of something who is trying to kind of advocate a better action, a better world, and so on. The term assumes that migrants or victims have the ability to deal with the trauma of displacement, act with what Japanese call self-responsibility, jiko sekinin, for their migration. And there's a hope that they can reconcile, smooth over the pain of this post-disaster living. Decontamination initiatives and efforts to restore living conditions in affected areas have led to the gradual lifting of evacuation order, allowing people to return to their kind of abandoned homes. After several, often very 5 years, the government promoted return to the affected areas, hoping to what they called normalize the situation. Particularly was important because the Olympic Games were happening in Tokyo, and they were sort of really trying to show that this is all now safe. We were there, 2018, 2 years before the Olympics, and well, at that time 2 years, but obviously it happened a year later because of the COVID. And everything was okay, wasn't it? Right? We can walk in the city when the summer shops were open. It looked abandoned, looked very strange. We came close to the nuclear power station, thinking, "Wow, it's absolutely crazy." Marcus was trying to use his fancy camera to look at it with it close. I said, breathing the polluted air. I was really, really scared. I was thinking, this is it. We're going to breathe the dust that is going to be forever inside me. I'm going to be the carrier of that poison, of that radiation. Things were there, all about normality. How do we kind of come back to normality? How do we kind of decontaminate the area? People moving in, and so on. So praising the sense of loyalty to community and the glorified notion of resilience. The return to normalcy was at the center of the Japanese society, recovery objectives and priorities. However, this urge for normality resulted in the obliteration of the events and their consequences, like it never happened. It's new. There's a kind of whole new village built in Yuriaki, where the sort of village is completely destroyed. Rather than development of a new coping strategies based on the very acknowledgement of the events themselves. So it was very politics of forgetting, erasing the things. Similarly, in broader migration studies, migrants are often expected to normalize such unknown events by bringing them into knowledge through rational decision-making or increased self-resilience. However, such movement towards the relationship with the foreign and uncanny relies on power of the migrant to represent difference. The power that, remember, that broken, morcellated, devastated subject doesn't really have. So if you're broken, how can you have the power to bring things into knowledge? So the encounter with authority leads to the interruption and destruction of the subject. And such trauma cannot be smoothed into a coherent sense of identity. An interruption of the migrant, destruction of facing death, moved forcefully several times, being ostracized, stigmatized as someone who should be coming back home in 5 years' time, leads to to the uncertainty, shattered dreams, interrupted continuity of living. So, how can we then express this? What's the way? And I'm very sympathetic to Angharad's attempts to try to express it in art. So, something which goes beyond language or other than language. So I'm trying to think with language in this presentation. And my thinking is based on attempts to respond to such a disaster, to trauma of dislocation, forced migration through poetry. How do we kind of put things into words in this case? As Jeremy Angles explains, part of the narrative about the Fukushima disaster is about the impossibility of both representing and understanding it. He states, after Fukushima, and I quote, "The Japanese population was struggling to find a language that would allow them to express their grief, horror, and anxiety." In this context, poets became leaders using dramatic and powerful language to provide momentary comfort, document the tragedy, and probe its philosophical and moral implications. So, similarly, geographers like Chris Feiler speak about the possibility of using poetic approach to expressing trauma without extracting affirmative meanings and attempting to resolve them in language. So the point here is to find the ways of letting trauma speak in itself without trying to kind of smooth over it and find the ways of saying trauma. in kind of in a positive connotation. So Chris Feiler draws on the work of German philosopher Theodor Adorno to explain that poetry reveals the inner workings of language as a failed possibility. Language cannot fully express things, and poetry is one of these examples. Poetry never fully discloses meaning. Something always remains hidden. It doesn't add up. You cannot fully understand because it doesn't kind of provide a complete picture. Poetry, as the French philosopher Maurice Blanchot states, refuses to decide and attach meanings to the silences. The poem, the height of language, Blanchot says, is the level of an interjection. He equates it to an interjection as inarticulate as the wink, a sign of one's neighbor. So a very kind of fleeting thing where you cannot really make a full sense of. Furthermore, the poem also reveals destabilization, disappearance of the principal voice, the individual. As the French poet Paul Celan speaks, and I'm trying to speak to our French colleagues here, present here. He stated, once the poem is really there, the poet is released from his original involvement in it. For those who mourn and suffer after Fukushima, the one who speaks in the disaster poems is both everyone and no one. Like a shadow which is never finished or complete, the poem speaks of the withdrawal or absence of the author. So, drawing on this inspiration from this earlier work, in our kind of analysis, we try to explore a possibility of responding to Fukushima in a twofold gesture, starting with analysis of death speaking after the disaster. So first we want to think about the exposure to death, being confronted with this an ultimate extremity, which reflects a limit experience, both an encounter with death as the limit of life, something when finishes when we die, we can no longer exist, and the language which pushes beyond its limits to express something that resists thinking. How do we speak about something we don't know? We cannot know death because we as long as we're alive, we don't have any relationship to death. So it's something which is inaccessible. We only know death after we die. So effectively, the knowledge disappears, doesn't it? So how do we kind of relate to this? Very complicated thing here. As an example, let's look at the collection of poems by Wago Ryochi, who was living in the city of Minamisoma in Fukushima prefecture when the Great East Japan earthquake struck. After spending 3 days in evacuation camp, so he was a forced migrant himself, he began writing his experience in the form of short poems of Twitter, later published under the title Pebbles of Poetry, which catapulted him to the position of one of the most famous poets in Japan. His poetry speaks about the trauma of the residents and victims in Tohoku, who were living anxiety-ridden lives surrounding the radiation, rubble, and death caused by the tsunami earthquake. Waga's poetry is broken by continuous repeats of phrase, radiation is falling, it's a quiet, quiet night. So it kind of continuously comes back to the sense of a rhythm and interruption. And it says he popped into his head when he was thinking about the effects of radiation. So he keeps referring to radiation as something which is continuously undermines his authority. He says, and my ghost called radiation, something which you can touch. Staring at there, my silence is disappearing. Staring at there, my anxiety is walking on my skin hastily. The next example is taken from the book Shino Mokuri, Poetry's Silent Bow by Wago Ryochi. Mokuri means to make a bow silently, giving a salute silently, making a bow without a word. So the sense of kind of coming to it in a very withdrawn kind of manner. In this example, Fukushima poetry expresses movement beyond intentionality. So here he says, fear the radiation. There is no possibility for getting food, water, and gasoline. When I lost my spirit, the urge to write poetry came to mind. I want to tell someone this despair that mankind has never experienced. I want to be immersed only in the writing. I want to record a time when death and destruction are beside in words, something which we cannot really say. So here, that sense of poetry being beyond intentionality, beyond what is meant by the author, is expressed in this form of the urge came to mind. Maybe sort of affective thing, if I speak the language, which is familiar to you, Angharad. So here it effaces and transforms the writer, makes him something different. Fukushima disaster brought about death that lies beyond one's comprehension. So death and destruction beyond words. In this case, one cannot experience or testify to one's own death. It reaches outside one's authority or personal self, thus producing an unexperienced experience. Death cannot be experienced. It cannot be related to. So the language of Fukushima points prevents direct communication with death, speaks to it without signifying it. Second, in our work, we consider the language that preserves distance with death, the immeasurable other, through passivity and self-withdrawal. So from that idea of a silent bow, something which is very common in traditional Japanese society. We're thinking about how Fukushima poetry creates the interval between life and death, where conversation holds open an interhuman space beyond reach. So let's consider another example. Here is, again, taken from Vagoraichi's book, Shinomokuri, Poetry Silent Bow. He says, bow in silence to tomorrow morning, bow in silence to the hearts of requiem scuds, bow in silence to Fukushima, what was proud. Keep silent is the only way to keep silent. Make a bow is the only way to do so. Both the survivors and those who are dying, quietly, souls from hand to hand. So instead of the figure of the migrant author, so he was a migrant displaced by Fukushima, who attempts to master death and complete meaning, we are faced with a disappearing author, someone who stands back and says, no, just be silent, bow to it, let it sort of overcome you. See what kind of a different relationship you can develop. So you're not trying to pretend that you create meaning. You don't have an ability to do so. Vulnerability, maybe think about capacity in these terms. Displaced Fukushima migrant finds himself open to strange, non-human forces like radiation, something that cannot be seen yet is deadly. The withdrawal of the subject is not linked to her capacity and determination, but to acquiescence and passivity. In place of the knowledgeable migrant subject, what we see is the emergence of what Leslie Hill describes, the anonymous, non-person, withdrawn from possibility, suspended, interrupted, effaced. So remember that figure of the migrant, broken, morcellated subject, someone who cannot write, so therefore now pretending to produce a coherent narrative. And the last poem which I want to kind of present to you here is coming from the book Moni Umi, The Sea of Ice, by the Japanese poet Hanmi Myo. It was published soon after the disaster. The text inscribes within it a separation from itself. There is a rupture between the cadaver, the body which is materialized, and the language which resists this materialization. It attempts to express a sense of having lost oneself and, most importantly, one's language in a confrontation with the unknowable, the unspeakable, immeasurable force of the disaster. So he says, from the inside of the water to that of the water, disassociated disease, disassociated words, dispersed, swam gently, and neck, hands, and legs without uniting, floating respectively, moving close just as algae, not words, like a bunch of Japanese pagoda tree leaves. Parts without words grew thick at the bottom of the sea. There's a sense of kind of devastation, loss of kind of sense of identity, but also an ability to express it in words. Everything is mixed up together here. The words are disassociated, as he says. So the encounter with alternative, death, tsunami, radiation, entails movement beyond oneself, which effaces and transforms the self, the migrant, at the same time. As French philosopher Maurice Blanchot explains, I quote, in this case, affliction, my relation with myself, is altered and lost, making of me this foreigner, this unknown from whom I'm separated by an infinite distance. So remember the picture of the migrant which I talked about in the beginning. Someone who becomes a foreigner, someone who has got another kind of penetrating, the radiation living within that person. So making themselves a foreigner, someone who can never pretend to be fully human and speak coherently as a kind of author of this story. So the encounter with authority leads to destruction of the subject through self-effacement when the otherness within the radiation, the trauma is accepted. So to conclude, what we try to do is try to follow traces of very different kind of language, very often meaningless language which doesn't mean to create a particular knowledge, in what Blanchot would call a fragmentary writing on Fukushima. Such discontinuous, fragmented writing moves away from the assertive author's voice towards interrupted and effaced expressions, which are not destined to leave the traces, but to erase by traces, all traces to disappear, in the words of Maurice Blanchot. So poetry moves beyond intentionality of the author and refuses to use author's terms in making traumatic encounter with death meaningful. There is no attempt to do so. The writing of the disaster, of the Fukushima, of the impossibility, Fukushima could not happen, in Blanchot's interpretation becomes the disaster of writing. So that sense of creating and effacing, producing and taking away. The writing of the disaster of writing, kind of referring. Something which resists interpretation and individual authority. Bearing witness to death in Fukushima calls for a different kind of communication that allows silence, trauma, separation, intermittence, the kind of emptiness itself, to speak. So poetry in this case communicates this trauma without attempting to recuperate it from language. It becomes, as Maurice Blanchot says, an expression of infinitude, an expression of vain death and mere nothing. And that's kind of with the statements to nothing I stop.
Thank you very much, Sergei. And great for this and this element of writing, specifically this language of things that kind of, are not quite captured, so something we can maybe react to as well. So again, one last time for this panel, I'm going to open it up to questions, suggestions, comments, any other interventions. Anyone would like to go first?
I could say that the only question and answer is silence, right?
Well, I was expecting that, exactly.
No, thanks very much. I mean, we already discussed about that because, we organized a seminar with other colleagues, and I just want to say that I really like this approach because it makes me think how we as a researcher try to explain, unveil, unfold, while poetry, for example, in this case, or art, do the contrary, like they hold, they veil, they work through silence. So I think that it's very interesting for us to understand also that sometimes we need different kind of tools and approach in order to approach the object of our research. So just a thanks.
I think it's probably a very simple question, but may not be. It may build on the last point a bit. But how distinctive is the poetry response compared to other forms of sort of artistic expression of this disaster? Things like visual art or music and that sort of thing.
There's lots of it, obviously. We were looking at different installations and artistic. There's also a couple of those pictures which are shown, were the responses by the artists to the disaster. So I was looking at drawings. What I'm really keen on thinking about writing in particular. So I can possibly look like Angharad did in terms of artistic response to the refugee crisis and look at the installations. I could have taken that approach. But I was really curious about how does language change. So that particular comment, because we sort of tend to work with language less than with images. And, I'm expected to publish things in a certain way, written in a certain fashion. I don't even know whether I can write it incoherently and start with a fragmented, broken language and publish it in an academic journal. But I think, there are obviously similarities in terms of the fact that people would try to find the different ways of expressing trauma. But I think language was really interesting for me. Thank you.
It's just a comment because it's really interesting. Just this morning I was listening to an interview of Syrian. He was talking about the fact of writing and he was talking about suicide, writing about suicide. And he was saying like that when you start writing something, it doesn't belong to you anymore. When you write about something, it becomes like foreign to you, and it just doesn't has to be part of you. And he was saying like, without writing about suicide, you would probably have committed suicide anyway. And it was allowing him to continue living, like writing on top. And I think it's really interesting, like as a way of coping, like maybe just in such disastrous events and something that you can really express, like just to make it less a part of you. Like you say you're stuck with it, but at the same time, if you write about it, like maybe it becomes less part of you.
That's interesting. Again, we're talking about Marx was giving me suggestions about the deconstructed text with a psychological tool. Chopped language was a very which.
Oh, the William Burroughs.
Yeah, we just kind of don't want to say that, but what it's about. Sorry, you're supposed to be chairing. Sorry, this is kind of this attempt to psychologists to sort of collect the narratives of people who experience trauma and then cut up the language, literally just whatever it is, and present it back as a sort of meaningless collection of things supposedly helping them to live with trauma. So where language becomes deliberately fragmented, chopped, so that they don't have to face some sort of, the same narrative again and again, which describes the feeling. So, yeah, there's interesting way in which the people are trying to put to use this sort of idea of fragmentation and separation. I'm sorry to finish with the death. I mean, it just feels like it's like real dampener in the end of the session. But we want to, yeah.
Thank you very much. A last thing from my side, and then we'll ready to go for lunch. But I found it really, really fascinating in terms of writing as well, and how you said you started off with sort of a focus on anxiety, and it kind of reminded me a lot. I've been reading, and you kind of got to that later on in the presentation about pain and how that relates to. And I wondered to myself, and I think you answered it slightly, so I'll elaborate a bit on that. But specifically to pain, that there can be instances of pain that are not necessarily sort of, let's say, separate from trauma, but things that can be comprehensible, but it's almost beyond language. Or pain is something that I'm probably going to put this crudely, but it's so hard to vocalize pain and put it into words. That can be seen in really little examples, like at the hospital when you're like, how much pain do you feel? And you have these smiley faces, or like 1 till 10. It's almost an example of how impossible it is to, or when you're in a moment of pain, after it has passed, you can sort of make sense of it, but in that moment, it really escapes language. So I was wondering that in regards to this, how to almost something that sort of seems to escape that, how to make sense of that, like scholarly. But I thought then you got to this idea of a prophetic response as something that by definition always is never finalized and never quite makes sense. That I found was quite for me good answer to that. So that was more of a comment than a question. But yeah, it reminded me a lot. I've been reading on pain now, so very fascinating and probably interesting for. Yeah, I guess always relating it back to migration studies of more to do with trauma, anxiety, things that sort of continuously escape that, and how we as researchers try and come to terms with that.
Yeah, thanks. No, like, as I say, I think you've kind of me stepping into the session maybe probably connects a little bit better to the sort of previous talks in terms of how the response to things like vulnerability, going beyond rationality. Questioning the idea of reason and so on. So yeah, poetry is never reasonable.
On that note, I think